Chapter 6. R. Harrison Dunn IV. A fine powdery snow, unseasonably late, had covered the ground with a blanket an inch deep and was still falling when at last the train reached Berlin. It was nearly an hour's walk from the central station to Ari's destination, the apartment of an American friend. No buses served that area of the city, and Ari didn't dare take a cab. The driver might be questioned and remember him. The dry powder crunched under his feet, and a bone-chilling wind seemed to go right through his pants and light jacket. The discomfort was hardly noticed, however, at the elation of knowing he had escaped and would soon be in a safe hiding place. The streets were alive with the early morning press of workers hurrying to their jobs. They were reluctantly bundled up against the unusual storm in winter clothes that had already been put away for the season. Ari held his hand over his wound and turned his head away whenever he encountered anyone along the sidewalk. No one seemed to notice him as they scurried past, each preoccupied with his own thoughts. After Ari had been walking briskly for about 40 minutes, the number of pedestrians thinned out until the streets were almost empty. Only an occasional small East German car, spewing exhaust, chugged past, while the number of large foreign cars and chauffeur-driven limousines increased dramatically. Ari had now entered one of the few once affluent neighborhoods in East Berlin that had been somewhat restored since that city's destruction. Many of the solid old brick or stone mansions had become embassy residences, mostly of diplomats representing Eastern Bloc countries. There were refurbished large apartments as well, which only the privileged upper class in this classless Marxist society could afford. Those that were not occupied by top Communist Party officials were leased to a few wealthy Westerners who had business of some nature in East Berlin, among them Ari's American friend, Roger Dunn. His apartment would make an ideal place to hide, assuming that the oft-extended welcome was still in effect. Roger was a tall, lanky Texan in his late 20s with crew-cut blonde hair, a quick smile, ready laugh, and an easygoing disposition. A clever cover, Ari sometimes thought, to hide the computer-like mind, which a glint in the steel-blue eyes only rarely betrayed. His father was an extremely wealthy cattle rancher, whose sprawling acreage had turned out to be rich in oil. As a result of that added wealth, R. Harrison Dunn III now had his finger in a surprising number of domestic and international banks, as Roger had casually confided. A close friend of fellow Texan Lyndon B. Johnson since childhood, the elder Dunn had been appointed to a United Nations diplomatic post when the latter became president at John F. Kennedy's death. He was now involved in arms negotiations with the Soviets at Geneva. It was from Roger that Ari had first learned that there was also corruption, even at the highest government levels, in the West. What a disillusionment that had been. Until that distressing revelation, he had imagined that Western democracies were immune to the viral dishonesty that was an endemic infection in Marxist regimes. LBJ, Roger had confided to Ari one day, broke laws at every level in his climb to the presidency, including vote stealing in order to get into the Senate. He's a scoundrel, but he's done a lot of good, too. Don't get the wrong idea. Johnson's lily white compared to the monsters running communist countries. That kind of corruption isn't possible under our system. But there's still a lot of selfish abuse of power, from the White House on down. What about your father? Ari had asked in surprise. If he's Johnson's close friend, what about him? Money is power, Roger had expounded dispassionately. My dad controls billions and knows how to use that leverage on an international scale, including Eastern Europe and even the Soviet Union. Really? I don't understand that. Ari had been greatly perplexed. Maybe I'm naive, but having lived all my life under Marxism, I can't fathom why capitalists would invest a pfennig in communist countries. The issue isn't so much Marxism against capitalism, Roger had explained patiently, but the survival of the whole human race. Western capital has financed Marxist regimes for decades. The stakes are too high to quibble over fine ethical points. Almost anything goes, including, well, let's just leave it at that. That was where the subject had been left, and Ari had never raised the issue since. As to where the young Texan himself fit into the picture, and why he was living in East Berlin, Discretion had always prevented Ari from asking. Maybe someday Roger would voluntarily tell him. It was during his periodic visits to the University of East Berlin that Ari had met Roger. They had taken an immediate liking to each other. Roger had encouraged Ari to practice his English on him, and their relationship had grown into a solid friendship. The young American, who was fluent in German, Russian, French, and several other languages, was a somewhat mysterious figure. There had never been any question of trust, however, because the mere fact that a person was an American was credential enough for any Eastern European. Roger had a diplomatic passport and traveled back and forth to West Germany on errands, which he never discussed. In fact, he spent most of his time in West Berlin, yet chose to live in the East to get a closer view of communism, as he explained. There was no doubt that this unusually knowledgeable and sophisticated American, whom Ari suspected of having ties with the CIA, hated Marxism with a passion. In their long discussions on the subject, the handsome Texan often predicted an end to the Cold War and the collapse of international communism. But when Ari asked him what made him think so, he would only smile cryptically and say, "Believe me, it's just a matter of time." Ari had been extremely careful about his contacts with Roger. They had met only at the university, always, seemingly, by chance, and only in confined public areas where it was a simple matter to know whether they were being observed. Ari had been confident that neither he nor Roger had ever been under surveillance. Nevertheless, as an extra precaution, he had never visited the American's apartment in spite of the repeated invitations and assurances that he was more than welcome if he ever needed a place to stay. That time had come now. The police would never find him there. When at last Ari turned onto Rogers Street, it was a great relief to find it deserted. Arriving eagerly at the address he'd long ago memorized, Ari recognized it immediately from Roger's descriptions. An unusually large apartment with a black-streaked, white marble facade and its own imposing entrance directly from the street. What if the American was away on a trip? Ari could only hope for some more luck. It was 8:10 a.m., and Ari was famished. A quick bite of breakfast would help him to sleep longer, something he desperately needed to do. Wearily, he climbed the half-dozen stone steps onto the broad marbled porch. Set in the rich facade beside the huge double door of solid dark mahogany was a lighted button. Over it, on a shiny brass plaque, was written R. Harrison Dunn IV, Esquire. Feeling suddenly nervous about the reception he might receive, Ari pushed the button. Muted musical chimes sounded within. Almost immediately, heavy footsteps could be heard approaching. The door opened, and there was Roger, towering over him with a scowl on his face and looking not at all friendly. "Who are you looking for?" he demanded, in flawless German that bore no trace of any foreign accent, let alone his usual Texas drawl. "Well, you told me to stop by sometime," said Ari, taken aback by the frigid reception. Then he realized that without his beard and with muddy, crumpled clothes and dried blood on the side of his face, he probably looked like a drunken bum to his wealthy friend. "I guess you don't recognize me," he added uncertainly. Roger had been looking at him closely, and his stern expression now changed to a broad grin. "Ari, you son of a gun!" he exclaimed in English. "What a surprise! Come on in." Ari glanced up and down the street. No one had followed him. He stepped quickly inside. "You told me so often to drop by," he began. "You bet I did, and I meant it." There was no doubt about Roger's warm enthusiasm. "You just make yourself at home, you hear?" He led the way through a long entrance hall into a lavishly furnished living room that opened onto a dining area with a large kitchen beyond. "Why did you shave your beard? I thought it looked great." "Just got tired of it," said Ari with a wry smile. "Besides, it gets itchy after a while." "I suppose so," returned Roger, sounding unconvinced. "I've never had a beard." "Boy, quite a place you've got here," continued Ari, trying to change the subject. "I've heard about that famous Southern hospitality. You're sure it's okay? I must look horrible." "Hey, you've come to the right place." Roger had been looking him over. "Been up all night crawling around in the brush and mud? Looks like you had a close call." "I ran into a branch. Didn't see it in the dark. Looks worse than it is." Roger smiled skeptically. Come on, Ari, we're friends. You can level with me. I've been around guns all my life. They almost had a funeral for you. Too exhausted to stand any longer, Ari sank back into an overstuffed armchair. His jacket fell back, exposing the Luger stuck in his belt. He quickly covered the weapon, then realized that Roger had already seen it. Ari sank back with a sheepish grin. "Yeah, you're right," he admitted. "Somebody almost got me." Roger let out a low whistle. "So you're on the run. I think you'd better tell me." "Look, I didn't want to get you in trouble," began Ari apologetically, "but I didn't know where else to go." "Don't worry. You're lucky you got here. I'll help you any way I can. Hide you, smuggle you out to the West, but I've got to know what we're dealing with." "Forget the West. I'm staying here to bring down that wall. You've told me it would happen." "Just level with me," said Roger. His smile was warm, but the steel blue eyes seemed to pierce into Ari's soul. "You know how much I hate Marxism. We've talked about it a lot. What I never told you, well, I've been involved in, revolutionary activities." Roger's eyes had relaxed and the smile broadened. "I've known that for a long time." Ari's mouth dropped open. "You have? How?" "I can't explain that right now." "Well, then, the Stasi, maybe they knew all along, too." "Nah, they didn't have a clue. Must have just got on to you." "If you knew all that, then why ask me?" "Just to make sure you'd tell the truth. If we're in this together, we've got to know we can trust each other." Roger was thinking. "I didn't see anyone. Nobody followed you?" he asked. Ari shook his head. "I'm positive, but this place must be watched." "They're not watching me." Roger's voice carried absolute conviction. "Now let's get down to practical matters. You need some breakfast and a bed. But first we've got to clean that wound. Looks nasty. Can't have an infection on our hands." He disappeared down a hallway that led off from the living room and returned in a few moments with a small bottle and some cotton. "Mouthwash?" asked Ari in surprise, reading the label. "It's all I've got, but it'll do the job. It's 37% alcohol." He soaked the cotton and scrubbed at the shallow gash mercilessly, making Ari grit his teeth with pain. "Sorry, but I've got to make sure it's clean. Can't take any chances." "I'm sure there isn't a microbe left," protested Ari. "Okay, now come into the kitchen. Sit yourself down at the table, there, while I get something for you. Then to bed." Ari was too exhausted to do anything but mechanically obey. He could hardly keep his eyes open while Roger fixed some toast and coffee. With that in his stomach, he followed his host as though he were groping through a thick fog. Roger led the way across the plush wall-to-wall carpet, through the well-furnished living room, and down the hall into a spacious bedroom with its own private bath, 2 king-sized beds with a folding partition between them, a desk and a sofa. A large sliding glass door opened onto an interior garden. "This is where my family stays when they visit." Roger's voice sounded miles away. "I'll put your briefcase here on the desk. Take either bed. I've got some things to do. Probably get back here around 3 o'clock. If you wake up before then and want anything, just help yourself." Too exhausted to do anything else, Ari pulled off his filthy clothes and collapsed into the nearest bed. A firm mattress, clean sheets, and warm blankets. What a welcome contrast to what he might have been facing at this very moment. Safe at last. "They'll never find me here. Roger, bless him. Maybe someday I can repay the favor." He drifted off into delicious unconsciousness. Without so much as a dream that he could remember, Ari awakened to hear rain beating on the window. A glance at his watch told him it was after 4 o'clock. 7 hours. Oh, I could use a little more, but I want to sleep tonight. He lay there for a few more luxurious moments, drifting in and out of consciousness, thinking how lucky it was that he'd met Roger those many months ago. At last, Ari forced himself to get out of bed. There, hanging over the back of a chair, he saw his muddied and bloodied clothes, now cleaned and pressed. What a friend Roger was, and what miracles could happen when money was no concern. He took a shower and dressed. There was the sound of movement at the other end of the apartment, and a tantalizing aroma was wafting into his room. Ari came slowly down the hall and stood just inside the living room, watching Roger, who was stirring something on the stove and hadn't seen him yet. "What do I smell?" he asked. "Oh, you're up," responded Roger cheerfully. "You were really zonked when I came back about an hour ago. I bet you've never smelled anything like this. Wait till you taste it. I'm making enchiladas, a Mexican dish. You'll love it. If you're staying with a Texan, you'll have to eat like one." "I'm hungry enough to eat the plates. And thanks for taking care of my clothes. How'd you do that?" "No problem. Just threw them into the washer and dryer. How about a beer?" "No thanks. Never touch it. Reminds me of my old man. He's an alcoholic. Gets ugly when he drinks." "Sorry about that. Say, I picked up a newspaper for you. It's over there on the sofa." "Thanks." Ari turned and took a few steps toward the paper, then froze. His picture, about 8 inches high, was on the front page. The headlines read, "Capitalist Conspiracy Uncovered." The lead article was headed, in large, bold print, "Manhunt Underway. Large Reward Offered." Feeling suddenly lightheaded, Ari picked up the paper, walked over to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. As he read, the words seemed to blur on the page. Roger busied himself silently with his cooking until Ari finished the article and threw the paper on the table with a curse. "It's a pretty wild tale," suggested Roger. "They make you sound like a one-man army. Any truth in it?" "Some. They've done a lot of guessing, and I can't believe they haven't found the police car yet. They stopped a train I was on." "Another train after the one you threw the 2 policemen from?" "Yeah, and they weren't police. They were Stasi." Roger stepped back from the stove and gave him an admiring look. "You must have 9 lives. Lucky you got here. Sounds like an incredible ordeal." "It was. I'm glad it's over." "I'd like to hear about it, sometime when you feel like it." "Yeah, rather not talk about it now. Later, maybe. I sure appreciate your taking me in. I don't want to put you in danger." "Don't mention it. I've got some ideas. We'll talk about them when we sit down to eat." Roger went back to his frying pan. Ari sat in deep thought. How long could he stay? When would he dare to venture out into the streets and start his work again? It seemed more certain to him now than ever that Roger was connected, if not to the CIA, then to some center of international influence that gave him access to Western intelligence. Otherwise, how could he have known so much? Would he do more than hide Ari? Perhaps use that power to help in other ways? Was that what he meant by some ideas? The momentary silence was broken by the musical sound of chimes. Someone's at the front door. Instinctively, Ari sprang to his feet, then sat back down in embarrassment. You can't jump at every shadow. Relax, said Roger. It's probably the mailman with a package I'm expecting. Turning the heat down under the frying pan, he went down the entry hall and opened the door. Ari could hear muffled voices in a brief exchange. Then he heard Roger exclaim angrily, You can't do this! I'm an American citizen. I have diplomatic immunity. Ari shoved his chair back from the table and stood up uncertainly. What was happening? Should he run to the bedroom for his gun? There were hurried footsteps coming toward him. Too late, Ari started across the living room toward the interior hallway. He was cut off by 2 men in business suits who burst into the room. The taller of the 2 had an ugly scar that angled across his face from chin to ear. His companion looked like a bulldog from pug nose and barrel chest to bowed legs. They were pointing submachine guns. From somewhere, Ari heard the chilling words, You're under arrest. Roger was standing behind the intruders, mouth agape and looking at Ari apologetically. I'm sorry, he kept repeating. I'm sorry. I don't know how they found you. The pressures of the last 48 hours seemed to crush Ari at last. He stood, stunned and motionless, unable to believe that after safely reaching this perfect haven, it could all end like this. Hands behind you. Mechanically, Ari obeyed. What was the point of trying to resist any longer? All his efforts to get here, and still they'd found him. Keeping their weapons aimed at Ari and an eye on Roger, the 2 men circled warily around on opposite sides, out of range of Ari's lethal feet, and came up behind him at last. Handcuffs were snapped on his wrists with speed and precision. While Scarface stayed with him, the bulldog ran down the hall and returned in almost no time. In despair, Ari noted that he was carrying the briefcase with its priceless contents. Then, one on each side, they grabbed his arms in vice-like grips. "Get moving," came the steel-cold order. Almost before he realized it had happened, Ari had been hustled out the front door past Roger, who was still frozen in helpless astonishment.